Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about unit testing the docs, or why you should test your code examples. So this talk is for you if you write docs about code and you want those docs to be more accurate, plus you want to save some time while you're maintaining those docs. So now a brief bit about myself. Hey, I'm Ben Perlmutter. I work on the MongoDB Realm docs team where I focus on the JavaScript SDKs, the Dart and Flutter SDK, and the backend as a service. In addition to this, I'm very interested in docs tooling, which is what I'll be talking about with you all today. Now let's run through the agenda of this presentation very briefly. First, we're going to talk about what code examples and unit tests are, then why you should be unit testing your code examples, when to unit test code examples, and how to go about implementing unit-tested code examples. Now just a brief bit of housekeeping first. Before we dive into everything, I just want to briefly note that all of the examples in this presentation will be using the Realm Node.js SDK. If you're not familiar with Realm, it's a mobile database. And what that means basically is you can embed a little Realm database in a device and save data from an application, like say an app on your phone, to the Realm database. And you can also sync that data fairly easily to a server. Then to the side here, we can see some Realm Node.js code. Towards the top, we're defining our database schema, opening a connection to the database, writing to the database, and reading from the database. Anyways, now let's take a quick look at what unit tests and code examples are, and then discuss why they matter for our docs. So first, unit tests. These are bits of code that run other code. You use them to validate to make sure that your code is working as expected. It's a very important part of the software development process. Basically, any non-trivial software project will have some unit tests in it. And a very important aspect of unit tests is that they be repeatable, meaning that you can run the same test over and over and over again and get the same results. Plus, when you're writing unit tests, there's usually frameworks to help you out. Pretty much every language, every major language at least, has one or more unit testing frameworks. JavaScript, for example, has quite a few. And in this presentation, all of the tests will be using the Jest testing framework, which you can see over here. Now let's discuss what code examples are. Code examples are little bits of code that live within your docs. They show the reader how to use that code, how the reader can use the code within their own software project. And often the code examples are even copy and pastable from the docs to the user's own project, either directly, like they can just use that code, or with a bit of modification use it. So it's really important that the code examples be clear and accurate because they're so crucial to the end user's usage of the code that you're documenting. And additionally, code examples are often stylized with syntax highlighting. So we can see here with this purple and pink code. And that is to make it stand out and resemble how the code would look in the developer's own environment. Now, while code examples are super important to any type of documentation, there are some very common challenges that occur when documenting code examples. This includes that it can be hard to keep your examples in the docs in sync with the interface of the code that you're documenting. That's because the code can change, like if there's a version upgrade or something, and then the interface will change. Maybe a method takes another parameter, for example, and you'll have to go throughout your whole docs to update that so the docs remain accurate and in sync with the source code. You also want to verify the functionality of your code example. In other words, you want to make sure it really works. And you want to be able to have a single source of truth for your code examples. You want to have them all in one place. And you want that so that it's more maintainable over time. And if you're working with other documentarians, everybody can collaborate on it in one place, know where to look. You don't have to go searching all over the place for code examples. One code example, one page in one repository, another in another. That would just get messy. So you want to centralize, have a single source of truth. So now we're going to talk about how unit testing our code examples can help solve these problems and make maintaining our documentation easier while we are able to add new features more quickly. All right, but before we talk about how unit testing can apply to our code examples, let's just talk about why we should be unit testing generally speaking. Unit tests, they validate that our code works the way that we intend it to, that the actual output is the same as our expectation of it. Unit tests also ensure that us as developers are actually using the code that we're writing, because it's not enough to just write it. You want to make sure you're using it, you understand how it works. And unit tests also make it easier for other developers to work with that code as well, because they can see it working within the unit test. Plus, unit tests, they often have little strings that serve as documentation showing what the test is about. So all of this together makes it much easier to work with the project. Also, you can incorporate your unit tests into a CI/CD pipeline, meaning that when you are ready to publish your changes and you push them to a server, say GitHub, then these tests will run, validating that everything is working as expected before you merge your changes and deploy it. Now let's take a look at how the same logic extends to code examples within our docs. So unit tests can validate that our example works the way that we intend it to, and make sure that us as documentarians are actually using the code that we document. Plus, unit tests, they make it easier for other documentarians to work with the code example because they have access to it within the unit tests, and any documentation within the unit test acts as a form of internal documentation for your technical writing team. So even if it's not making it to the final published docs, it's something for you to use as a reference to understand the thing that you are documenting. And lastly, if you're using a docs as code approach to your documentation, you can incorporate your unit tests of code examples in the CI/CD pipeline to validate that the unit tests for the code examples are working as expected before you publish your docs. And then not for nothing, the unit tests probably already exist. What do I mean by that? There's probably already unit tests for whatever the feature is that you're documenting, and that unit test was probably written by the actual feature development team. So even if you can't borrow it outright, you can't just copy and paste it over to your code example unit test suite, then you can likely borrow from it conceptually to help you write your own unit tests, making things easier. Now, when you're implementing unit-tested code examples, there's a couple of things that you might want to keep in mind before you get started. One is what unit testing framework you use. As mentioned before, most major languages have at least one major unit testing framework. So if there's more than one, you got to decide which of the few you're going with. Often the answer to this is whichever framework the feature development team is using. You want to use as well, just so you can borrow from them and communicate with them better. Then you also want to consider, are there any language or technology-specific tools that you can be using? For example, if you're working with Python, there's Jupyter Notebooks, which are websites that can run Python. And if that's something that interests you, I highly recommend checking out this previous Write the Docs talk called Word Documentation, Cloud-Hosted Interactive Tutorials, and Continuous Integration Testing Intersect, presented by Dan Gunter at Write the Docs Portland a couple years ago. does an excellent job explaining how you can use Jupyter notebooks to test your Python code examples within your documentation. And now let's talk about some of the best scenarios when you can test your code examples. So one of the best use cases for tested code examples is when you're documenting code libraries, things like SDKs or middleware, basically any code that is intended to be used by other developers. Also for tutorials, because tutorials often have like a series of steps in them, code that interplays. You want to make sure that's all working well together. This is especially true because tutorials often your reader's first taste of whatever it is you're documenting, and you want to make sure that everything's working, that it tastes good, so to speak. And then also for complex examples, more generally, like let's say a handshake procedure, you want to have some unit tests there just to make sure that everything is working well, that nothing has broken in the complexity. And also when you're integrating third-party services, say an external API, you want to test that to make sure that even if nothing in your code has changed, that if anything in the third-party services code has changed, it doesn't break whatever it is that you're documenting. And you can validate this with a test. And now if you're a testing purist, you're probably thinking to yourself right now, well, that's not a unit test. That's an integration test. To which I would respond, yeah, you're right. It is an integration test. But even though the topic of this presentation is unit testing the docs, I thought that this is important and relevant and therefore worth noting. Perhaps next year, me or somebody else can do a integration test the docs presentation. Now let's talk about a couple of different implementations that we can use for unit testing code examples. We're going to discuss two. First, a fairly simple one where we copy and paste code from our unit test to the docs. And then a more complex but more powerful one, which we actually came up with on the MongoDB Realm Docs team to extract and transclude code examples from our unit test to the docs. And if you're not sure what that means, hang tight, we'll get to it soon. But first, copying and pasting. This is a great way to get started with unit testing docs. Anyways, let's walk through the basic flow of this. So first, you write your code example in a unit test. You make that test pass. You copy the code example from the unit test and paste it into your docs. Simple as that. Let's take a look at this in practice. So here we have a little unit test about creating data in the Realm database. So we have our code example here and the expectation validating if the test pass or fail down there. Then, assuming the test pass, we copy the code example and paste it within our docs. Very simple. Then we can see here the code example rendered within our documentation site. Now let's take a look briefly at some of the advantages and disadvantages of this implementation. So first, and really most importantly, you get all of the advantages of tested code examples that we discussed before. And you also don't need to incorporate any new tools into your workflow, which is nice. As long as you're using a machine that can copy and paste, you can do this. And I think pretty much every computer of the past 40 years can copy and paste, so you should be covered on that. But then on the other hand, this implementation does have some limits. Namely, that's a very manual process to include these code samples. And as a result of the process being so manual, it can be kind of hard to maintain because you just need to continually be copying and pasting, which can get annoying. And then you run the additional risk of there not being a single source of truth. So the code examples within your docs could potentially drift away from the code examples in your unit test if somebody, for example, updates one but not the other. And if you have like a lot of open source contributors, or maybe people not directly on your docs team but still within the organization contributing to your docs, you run the risk of this. Also, not for nothing, when you're copying and pasting a bunch, formatting can get weird as you go from the copy file to the paste file, and continually adjusting the formatting can be quite annoying, and it can also be kind of error prone. You risk the formatting being wrong in the rendered docs. And lastly, when you're doing this copy and paste implementation, there's no way to programmatically modify the code from within the unit test to your docs. So like if you want to remove a line, for example, there's no good way to always do that. You just have to remember to do it after you paste it. So due to the limits of the copy and paste implementation, the Realm Docs team has come up with a new and more powerful process for unit testing our code examples, which we call extraction and transclusion. Basically, how this works at a high level is we've come up with this tool called Bluehawk that we use to create our code examples in separate files. They pull them from the unit test to separate files. Then we use markup language transclusion to add it to the docs. And if that's a little confusing to you right now, don't worry. I'm about to explain it in detail. So first, let's talk about Bluehawk, the tool that helps make this possible. Bluehawk is a command line-based tool that we can use to annotate our code with comments. In this case, the code being our unit test, the examples in there. And we annotate the code specifying what we want to extract into separate generated files. And then in order to generate those files, we use the Bluehawk CLI to create them. Oh yeah, this is not our real logo at the moment. We don't have a logo. If you're an astute observer or fan of the logos of the internet, you may notice that this is the Firefox logo in blue with a blue bird's head on top of it. If you have any logo ideas for us, you feel inspired, want to create one, let me know. I'll provide my email towards the end of the presentation. We would love to have a better logo than this. We just needed a visual indicator of some sort for the presentation. Also consider this logo didn't quite make the cut. Now, a very brief history of Bluehawk. As mentioned, it was developed by my team at MongoDB, the Realm Docs team. I wish that I could take credit for Bluehawk, however, I cannot. It was developed well before my time. The development was led by Caleb Thompson and Chris Bush, who was of previous Write the Docs fame. Chris gave a talk here a couple years ago about SDK reference manuals. Hey, Chris. And bye, Chris. The goal that led to the initial development of Bluehawk was we wanted one tool that we could use to programmatically extract code examples in the variety of languages that our SDKs use. And it was very important to have one tool that we could use with all of them, just to keep ourselves sane, have one system across all of these SDKs. We actually just came out the 1.00 release of Bluehawk, which you can check out if you're curious by running npm install-g Bluehawk. I will also put a link to the documentation later in the presentation where you can check that out. And just a bit about our usage of Bluehawk at the moment. So as mentioned, we have quite a few SDKs, 8 at the moment. And for our documentation project, we've had 41 contributors so far and have generated over 2,000 code examples. So hopefully this can show how Bluehawk really can be used to effectively and efficiently maintain code examples and do it within unit tests for a large docs project. Now let's take a quick walkthrough of how Bluehawk works. First, you write your code and then you annotate it with these special Bluehawk comments, which we call tags. So this tag, or these two tags, snippet start and snippet end, they denote the beginning and the end of a code snippet, which Bluehawk, through the CLI, will turn into a generated file. Then we have additional tags that you can use to remove bits from the source to the generated file, or uncomment stuff that was in comments. There's some additional tags as well that you can use for stuff like conditionally rendering content, replacing words, emphasizing bits. And once you've annotated the code with tags, we can create our generated files using the Bluehawk CLI. To do that, we run the command bluehawk snip, then our file name, the source file, and we specify the output directory. Once you run that, Bluehawk will deposit the generated file to the output directory, as we can see here. So this is the generated file from the source code that we were just looking at. And if you would like to learn more about Bluehawk, you can check out the documentation site here. I'm also going to put it in the chat of the conference, so you can just click on that link. Now that we've discussed how you can use Bluehawk to extract your code examples, let's discuss the second part of this flow, transclusion. Transclusion at a high level is when you include contents of one document inside of another. If you're not familiar with this term, don't worry, don't feel bad. I, in fact, did not know this term until I started making this presentation, and I stumbled upon it. I was like, oh, hey, that's exactly what we're doing. Let me put that word in there. And even if you're not familiar with transclusion as a term, you likely are familiar with it as a concept because it's a very common feature in popular documentation platforms. For example, Sphinx has literal include for this, Docusaurus raw loader imports. Pick a popular documentation platform, and it likely has some transclusion implementation. Now let's take a quick look at an example of how we can use transclusion to bring code examples from our source files into our docs. So to the side here, we have this x.js file with some code. Then we're going to transclude it into this documentation file with this x.js, which would create a rendered output looking something like this, where the code lives now within the documentation. Now let's review the extraction and transclusion flow to see how we can put together unit-tested code examples with Bluehawk with transclusion to add our code examples to our docs. Then we'll discuss why we should do this implementation. First, you write your code example in a unit test, make that test pass. Then you annotate the unit test with those Bluehawk tags noting what you want to extract. After that, you do the actual extraction using Bluehawk CLI. And lastly, you transclude the code example into your docs. Let's take a look at an example here, this time for a unit test about updating data within a realm. So we have our code example here and the test expectation. If that pass, we add our Bluehawk annotations. We're tagging what we want to extract. Then we do the actual extraction using the Bluehawk CLI here, which will give us a generated file looking something like this. This is just the code from that unit test we were just looking at. And then we can transclude that code into our docs. This example here is using Docusaurus and Docusaurus raw loader transclusion feature. So on line 6, we are importing the code into this document, and on line 33, rendering it within our docs. So then it will look like this. We can see that code example here living within the docs. Now let's take a look at why we would want to go with this implementation. First, just like the copy and paste implementation, this has all of the advantages of unit-tested code examples that we discussed before. Plus, due to those Bluehawk tags, you have a better record of where those code examples are. And as you have the tags defining what your code examples are, your unit tests really act as a single source of truth for what your code examples are. You don't have to worry about them in a variety of locations within a repo, within many repos, living on somebody's desktop somewhere. And also, as you have the single source of truth, the whole process is much more repeatable. You can just run the CLI operations or even automate it further with a script to generate your code snippets. And then you have those Bluehawk tags like replace or uncomment or remove to modify your code examples from how they are in the unit test to how they will be in the docs, which is a nice to have feature. So while this is in many respects an improvement on the copy and paste implementation, much more powerful, it is not without its flaws. Namely, it might be a little less automated than we'd like, because you do still need to run the CLI operations and do the transclusion, which I think is better than copying and pasting. However, it's still work that we have to do. And we like to avoid work if we can, right? Yeah, you have to rerun those CLI operations to regenerate the same file, which can get tiresome. And also, you should be committing the generated files to version control, like Git, for example, if you're doing this implementation, because while they are generated, you're generating them programmatically as opposed to automatically with the CLI. And therefore, it's better to commit them just to guarantee that they are in fact there. But with that being said, due to these relative disadvantages, we are working on some additional features to remediate them with Bluehawk. I don't have anything further to report upon that during this presentation, but hopefully there'll be some more information about that soon, which you'll be able to see on the Bluehawk's docs site, or maybe even a future Write the Docs presentation. Now let's discuss one further advantage of unit testing your code examples. You can use them with continuous integration. But first, let's define what a continuous integration test is. Basically, this is a test that runs when you add code to a remote version control system. The best case for this, best example, is probably like when you add a pull request to a remote Git repository, like on GitHub, for example. Then a test will run, making sure that everything passes before you deploy your code. And we want to do this for our code examples because it just ensures that our code is working before any docs actually get published. Because in case you forgot to do something locally, this happens automatically, guaranteeing that everything is working as expected. Plus, you have a nice public record of everything working, which is always good, especially if, let's say, there's some difference between your development environment and maybe that of your users. Continuous integration tests can catch any discrepancies there if there might be a problem. And then, not for nothing, it's generally pretty easy to set up the continuous integration tests if you already have your unit tests due to handy tools like GitHub Actions or Travis CI. Here, for example, is a GitHub action that tests that all of the unit tests from the Realm Node.js SDK are passing. Assuming they pass, we'll get a nice green check mark as we see here, letting us know that it is safe to deploy our changes and publish our docs. Woohoo! So that wraps it up in terms of the new content for this presentation, but let's just quickly review everything that we've covered. First, we talked about the various reasons to unit test code examples. One being that you want to validate that the code works as intended, and unit tests can help do this. Plus, unit tests, they can ensure that your code, that rather you as a documentarian are actually using the code that you're documenting. Plus, it makes it easier for others on your team to work with those code examples as well within the context of the unit tests. And the unit tests can serve as a form of internal documentation for your team. Then finally, we can incorporate those unit tests that we've written into a CI/CD pipeline if we're doing docs as code, just as a form of quality assurance, of validation before we publish our docs. We also talked about a couple of different ways to implement unit-tested code examples. First, the fairly simple and straightforward copy and paste implementation. And then the extract and transclude implementation using Bluehawk. And we wrapped it up talking about how we can use unit tests, the ones that we've already written within our CI/CD pipeline, to help our docs be more accurate. And that about covers it. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you learned something. I hope that if you're not already unit testing your code examples, you're interested in doing it now. And if you'd like to get in touch with me about unit testing code examples, Bluehawk, or anything else, you can reach out to me at ben.p@mongodb.com. And if you're interested in working on the Realm docs, on Bluehawk, or anything else at MongoDB, we are in fact hiring. We have a bunch of writer positions open right now. You can learn more about those at mongodb.com/careers. Once again, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to talk. You can find me at ben.p@mongodb.com. And that covers it. Thank you so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye.
For Marcia and Dave, I got this question, which got a ton of thumbs up and a ton of yes, I want to know this too. It's, why did your team choose AsciiDoc over one of the Markdown languages? And I don't know if this is contentious.
Dave, I defer to you. You may have been involved in that. Yeah.
I mean, to be perfectly honest, AsciiDoctor does a great job of rendering HTML pages based on, just plain simple text files that any partner can understand or any, contributor can understand. There are Markdown tools that do the same. So it was really, 6 in one, half dozen in the other. There's no particular reason that we chose the one over the other. It's just, we decided that it worked best for our use case.
Such a simple question, or simple answer for a question.
I'm sorry, I don't have more. Like a more in-depth reason that we chose it, but no, it's.
But sometimes you have to make a decision, right?
Yeah, it was just an arbitrary decision.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
And I was not involved in those conversations, so I just jumped on once the decision was made, and I wish I had more to offer on that, but I really loved all the questions and the enthusiasm around that.
Mm-hmm. For a quick follow-up, how did you manage collaborating, if you did, with people who weren't as familiar with it? Sometimes, interactions with other tools or people who haven't used them before can be a little tricky. Was that something that you dealt with?
Yeah, so we have built bash scripts that execute in our CI pipeline that automatically build out the HTML documents. So our collaborators, our partners that we work with, our customers we work with, third parties who work with our open source stuff, they don't have to know any of that backend stuff. All they have to know is, here's a text file. It says, what's the name of the document? Who are the names of the contributors? What are the pre-deployment steps, et cetera. They just have to fill out text, and then our pipeline handles all of the workload. So it really hasn't been an issue because we've offloaded all of that away from partners and away from other contributors to our pipeline.
Wow, that's amazing. It sounds like it's really seamless.
Yes.
Yeah, continuing with the technical questions, but for Ben now, there was a really great discussion in the chat for people who are wondering just how you keep code current. I think every time you have a copy-paste situation, people's knuckles turn a little white because they're worried that if the code itself changes, how is it possible to keep the docs updated? And so maybe you could calm us down a little bit with that idea.
Sure. So I think the unit test would hopefully capture whatever that change is. So if, let's say a parameter passed to some method changes in whatever the source code is, when you upgrade a version in the code within your unit test, you would upgrade the version, and the unit test would then catch, hey, you're missing a parameter, and you know that you need to update that. And via the fact that using Bluehawk, if you are using Bluehawk, you can then just automatically regenerate those code examples to the same output files. You just rerun the CLI operation either manually or via some script or continuous integration system. It would update itself.
Oh, again, like just the fact that you can automate something and make it feel seamless, that's incredible. We had one question that was posed for Dave and Marcia, but I think we can really apply it to both scenarios. Is how are these processes received in the larger company? Some people get a little worried with change and with, they get really set into their processes. So I don't know if that's something that everybody here has, if they've encountered it before. Maybe we can start with Dave and Marcia, and then we can switch over to Ben.
Marcia, would you like me to take this one?
Well, I'll quickly say and then hand it off to you, Dave, that what convinced people was that we saved time. So really that was a no-brainer once we could prove that this process made a difference. Everybody knew the old process was painful, so people were very open to trying something new. It's partly the Amazon and AWS culture of trying new things, and partly just that we could say, hey, we've done a test, look at the difference it made. Dave?
Yeah, and so again, everything that we do is open source. This is open to the public, but that's also open, obviously, internally to other teams at AWS. So we produced a process that, like Marcia said, it saved a lot of time, saved a lot of energy, removed a lot of barriers in terms of formatting and whatnot. And so other teams have also embraced a lot of our processes. They look at what we've done, they see that it's saved time, they see that it's improved efficiency, and they're starting to adopt it.
Great. Ben, is that something that you've dealt with before?
Yeah, sure. I can talk a bit on that. So currently, us on the Realm Docs team, we are the only documentation team at MongoDB that does use Bluehawk. And we are the only one of, I believe there are 4 teams at present. And I don't have a particularly good reason for you why we are the only team that uses Bluehawk. We are the ones who made it. So that's certainly why we use it, but why they don't, I'm not exactly sure. There's certainly been a significant degree of interest from the other teams. However, none have adopted quite yet. Bluehawk is fairly new. As mentioned in the presentation, we did just come out with 1.0. That was on Friday, actually. So like 3 days ago. So while they haven't adopted it yet, perhaps that'll be changing soon.
You've been so busy. I'm just so appreciative that you also found the time to come talk with us. I'm sure same with Marcia and Dave. Kenzie actually made a really good point in the chat. It's a lot easier to fix things if they're demonstrably broken, harder to convince people to make major improvements to systems that at least appear to mostly work. Appear might be the operative word there. I think that's such a great point and something that all of you seem to have dealt with so well. And so I think a lot of us are maybe in this Q&A thinking, oh, I really want to do that too. And it's inspiring to see people who've made it happen. So I think that's really great. Ben, another question for you. When you're pulling examples from tests to docs, how do you manage user-supplied values for variables in code samples? Sorry, examples.
Sure. So there's 2 primary ways that we do that. One is you could say like a Bluehawk native way. And that is, there's actually a Bluehawk tag called replace, which basically does like a global find replace operation on the stuff within your Bluehawk snippets. So you could use that, which can be quite powerful, but it might be a little complex to implement. Or what I tend to do is, let's say the user supplied value would be like var, my value equals, let's say my API key, whatever the API key may be. I would just above the snippet define whatever the API key that I'm using within the test is in its own variable, name that variable my API key, and put that variable named my API key with the one below that's actually within the example.
Great, thanks. There's a question in the chat. Maybe this one would be good for Marcia. Is Docs' code worth doing as a lone writer? And any advice for someone taking on Docs' code solo?
Oh my goodness. I don't know how to answer that question well, because I haven't done it as a solo writer. There are several writers on our team, and I've been very grateful that we've been doing it together. But it certainly seems to me like it would make sense, whether you're solo or working with a team, just the efficiencies that are possible. And in a sense, Docs' code enables everybody involved to put on a tech writer hat. So when Dave is working on documentation, he's essentially a tech writer. So you're not really a solo tech writer when you're working in Docs' code. That's what comes to me to say. If anybody has done it as a solo tech writer, I would welcome your comments, what your experience was in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was thinking that maybe just with your experience and what you've seen and write the docs and everything, that you might have a cool take on that. Thank you. Another question, did you find any resistance for writers leaving Word, then going to AsciiDoc?
Yes, I saw that question, and my answer may not have been very satisfactory in the chat because I just simply said no, but I'm not sure that that's accurate now that I think about it. I mean, even I resist in a way, because Word is comfortable, it's familiar, we all know how to do it, and making the change to AsciiDoc and the whole process of working in GitHub for our docs and learning how to do PRs and giving up some control. Honestly, as a tech writer, I was used to, and my team of tech writers, we were used to being basically the gatekeepers of content. Nobody could push a PDF out without us. We did it. In GitHub and in the open source world in general, there's not that same sense of ownership and being the guardians. And so you have to give up some of that. And I think there's a little bit of every tech writer that has some resistance to giving up control. Maybe it's just me, but it's been on balance really worthwhile, and we've found ways to keep control where it's really important.
Yeah, and speaking from the developer side, there was absolutely no resistance on our end. We were all so relieved to get away from Word docs with the column on the right-hand side that had all the messages and the comments and the back and forth. We were so relieved to move toward a GitHub, pull requests, commit version, which is what we're used to, in our day-to-day lives. So I saw no resistance whatsoever on the developer side. I can't speak to the tech writer side.
I was a little worried that if you kept on describing what things look like in Word, you might give some people nightmares. So that's great. Maybe we've got time for one-ish more question. We had an interesting question about timing. So how you coordinate code releases with doc releases. What if there is no code release? I'm sure timing is something that we all think about. Maybe we could go the other way and start with Ben just to see if you've got any insights there, and then we can move to Dave and Marcia.
Yeah, so at MongoDB on the Realm Docs team, we don't have like one set practice there. Probably largely informed by the fact that we're documenting, I believe it is 8 different SDKs, each of which has its own release system. On our docs team, I think we have 7 different writers. So sort of the responsibility of like one writer to keep track of a certain SDK and to be monitoring what they're doing. Maybe there's a pre-release that's published somehow, or like you can just use that code locally, or you just have to use some examples supplied by the actual feature developers. And then whenever, through your coordination, just largely in Slack, that it seems that the docs are ready to be published, we'll merge our changes and publish.
Great. Dave and Marcia, what's that look like for you?
Dave, you want to take that one first?
I apologize. I was in the chat. Would you mind repeating the question?
Yeah, just what does timing look like? So, and of course, I've scrolled away from the question.
I apologize. Again, I'm sorry. I was in the chat.
No, all good.
So we have moved to a procedure where we have separate GitHub branches for documentation and for code. So previously, during our initial Docs 2.0 deployment, we had everything stored at the same branch. So if there's a code update and there's also a documentation update, they could be submitted at the same time, or if there's just one or the other, they'd be submitted separately. But now we've completely separated the two. So if we have a product that needs just documentation update, right, there's a new URL for a license or whatever, we can submit that without having to worry about any code updates, without having to worry about any code testing, etc. And vice versa, if we have a code update, so we have a product that's gone from version 1.1 to 1.2 or whatever that doesn't require any documentation update, we can just submit it separately. So we've segregated code and documentation into different branches.
And the downside of that is that it takes something to be conscientious. If you do update the code in a way that has an impact or should have an impact on the instructions in the guide, you have to make a point to go over and make that update. So it is possible. There's nothing automated right now. I know this question came up earlier in the chat. That there's nothing automated that requires you to go over and update the doc when you update the code. Nobody gets tapped on the shoulder to say, hey, this is going to affect, people need to know about this in the deployment guide. So it's a little bit of a gap that requires human consciousness to go over and make that update. And it doesn't always happen, to be honest. So I don't know of a perfect way to address that.
If you did, I would hope that you would come back in the future and tell us.
If anyone out there knows, please share.
Your talks, it'll go right to the start. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I wanted to thank the three of you again for coming in and just sharing all of your experience and all of your knowledge. All of us were so lucky to be here and to hear both your talks and your questions as well. Your answers to all of our questions. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions. I apologize we couldn't get to all of them. We're going to take a little break. The next talk starts at 11:10 Pacific on the main stage. Just a reminder that Unconference is going strong. You can go into the Sessions tab and check them out. Also, if you want to submit a 5-minute lightning talk proposal, you've got until 11:45 Pacific, so good luck. And thank you again to the three of you. This was so fun, and I hope we get to see you in the chat for other talks.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.